But the figure I need to know what.
On the different parts of the brain?
No, this
Oh,
is right at the
okay.
top.
What I was referring to there is an important dopamine pathway that extends, well, let me just put on the board what I was talking about and what I was, the primary reason I was focusing on that. You've got the ventral tegmental area. Which is often abbreviated as the VTA. And before I go any further, just because this is something you might need to know in a test, where in the brain would you find the ventral tegmental area? And I'll keep it simple at this point. Is it in the hindbrain, the midbrain, or the forebrain? First thing, think about the middle term here, tegmentum. That would suggest a tegmentum. Where is the tegmentum located? Midbrain, hindbrain, forebrain?
Midbrain.
Midbrain. It's the floor of the midbrain. Okay, so we've got this area in the midbrain that projects to another area called the nucleus accumbens, which is in the forebrain. And the pathway between the VTA and the nucleus accumbens utilizes dopamine as its neurotransmitter. And the point I was making about this particular pathway is that it plays an extremely important role in the reinforcing effects of drugs. This pathway lights up. You get lots of increased activity here that occur as a result of the ingestion of a lot of different kinds of drugs. It's a part of it's a pathway that partly underlies the euphoric effects, the pleasant effects that some drugs produce. And that's what I'm referring to by the positively reinforcing effects. The things about the drug that make a person feel good. They like it. And this pathway plays a very important role in that. And I wanted you to be aware of the fact that the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, are strongly implicated in the reinforcing effects of drugs. And that dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter. I think I even used some other examples of things that might light this up. If I'm sitting in that new casino they're going to be building here before start building next year, and I'm playing poker and I win a big jackpot, that pathway in my brain is probably going to light up. Abby, what's something that makes you feel good?
I don't know. Running.
Running? Well, it's very likely that, God, that wouldn't make me feel good. But anyway, very likely when you're running and you're deriving pleasure from that, that pathway is lit up in your brain, along with some other things. Part of that positive feeling from running is probably due to the release of endorphins in the, what part of the brain? This is another review question. What part of the brain did we talk about as being an important source of endorphins? And as a result, plays a role in positively reinforcing effects of drugs, but also plays an important role in the body's natural analgesic response. Come on, ladies. This is from chapter 2. Our selective tour of the brain. It's found in the midbrain. There's one hint. It surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, which connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle.
Is it the para-aqueductal gray?
Para-aqueductal gray.
So, all in his notes he has is the analgesic effect. What was the other thing he said?
Do what now?
All that Walker had in his notes was the analgesic effects. What else?
Oh, and well, primarily that's the
Okay.
thing. The other thing is that it can contribute to the positively reinforcing effects of drugs because if you think about it, people who use opium, heroin, and those kinds of drugs, part of the reason they do that is because it makes them feel good. And that's partly because, due to the fact that with those drugs, you're not only stimulating the para-aqueductal gray, you're stimulating that pathway right there. Say the day you missed Cheyenne, which was the day we covered the brain in an hour and 15 minutes, wasn't the best day to miss.
Yep, I figured that. And I was trying to find my notes from physio, but I can't find them. Because I did just learn this all last semester.
Yeah.
So.
It hadn't been that terribly long ago. And I don't know how good Walker's notes are, but I told people to rely primarily on the notes for things to remember because in the book it talks about those and other things, but I didn't expect you to remember all the other stuff.
Yeah, I was trying to look at that book too, so.
Let me just throw out a few brain structures and see what you can tell me about them. Let's start with the medulla.
Responsible for things like heart rate and digestion.
Heart rate and respiration. I mean, those are two important things. You got primary respiratory centers, primary cardiac centers in the medulla. What's a third thing I said about the medulla that is noteworthy?
It regulates sleep and wakefulness.
Well, there are centers related to that play a role. But there was something else I specifically pointed out in class that I wanted you to be aware of.
Was it about drug overdose?
Well, that's a part too, because with some drugs, particularly depressant drugs, they're going to, if you, let's take alcohol as an example. You get blood alcohol concentrations too high, that's going to depress the respiratory centers. You depress them enough, they're going to quit sending out signals. Therefore, the diaphragm quits contracting, therefore you quit breathing, therefore you suffocate. But this had more to do with the anatomy of this part of the brain rather than the physiology of it. Is there anywhere in his notes or the rest of your notes about decussation or crossing over
Yeah.
of nerve fibers?
Yes.
As fibers rise, go through the spinal cord up towards the brain, carrying sensory information, a lot of those are going to cross over or decussate at the level of the medulla, go up to the left half of the brain, which will process that information. Motor commands coming down from the left half of the brain, some of them will cross over at the medulla to the right side, go down and control the right side of the body. This is part of the reason why it's said that the right half of the brain controls the left half of the body, left half of the brain controls the right half of the body. It's a reason why Kyla, if you work with a stroke patient in the nursing home, they have a stroke and then they have motor problems on the right half of the body, then you know that the stroke occurred in the left half of the brain. Okay, let's see. What about the cerebellum? What's the primary thing I mentioned that the cerebellum does?
Controls coordination of voluntary movements.
Integrates and coordinates voluntary muscle movement, motor behavior. And I'd said that if you were to damage the cerebellum, then you would have problems with your ability to walk and ability to do things in a coordinated fashion. And an example I used of what cerebellar damage might be like would be a person who's consumed enough alcohol, they're having trouble navigating. They're wobbly, they can't walk very well, their coordination's impaired. That's very similar to what cerebellar damage would be like. Okay, superior colliculus. I'm just randomly picking out things that we talked about. Go ahead and answer while I'm playing with this. That's not what I want. Apparently we don't know what the superior colliculus is involved with.
Visual reflexes.
Visual reflexes. The superior colliculus, the inferior colliculus together make up what? Or I should say the superior colliculi plus the inferior colliculi combined make up a part of the brain called the what? Tectum, which is the roof of the midbrain. What about the substantia nigra? What did I say about it?
It's critical for inhibition and modulation of movement.
Plays a very important role in voluntary movement as well. I mean, the cerebellum does, but there are multiple pathways in the brain for regulating movement. The substantia nigra projects to the basal ganglia, and that pathway is the one that's damaged in people with Parkinson's disease. What about the hypothalamus? Here you ought to be able to tell me at least 2 or 3 or 4 things that the hypothalamus is involved in. Because it's involved in a whole heck of a lot of stuff.
Homeostasis.
Homeostasis is a very important one. Things like temperature regulation, hunger, thirst. It's the point of interaction between the nervous system and the endocrine system because it influences the pituitary gland. It's involved in sexual motivation and behavior. To some extent, it's involved in sleep and wakefulness. To some extent, it's involved in aggressive behavior. It's just involved in a bunch of junk. What's the primary thing I wanted you to know about the thalamus? And there was just one primary thing on the thalamus. One primary thing I wanted you to know about it.
That it processes sensory and motor information.
Yeah, and the important thing about it is that it's a relay station for incoming sensory information. It's part of the visual pathway, for example. Information coming in from the eyes is directed to the thalamus, which then will project that information to the appropriate part of the brain where visual input is interpreted. The auditory pathway goes through the thalamus and then is projected to the primary auditory cortex, as a couple of examples. Okay, now related to those 2 examples, where would you find in the brain the primary visual cortex?
Occipital?
Occipital lobe. Where would you find the primary auditory cortex? Which lobe? Tyler?
Temporal.
Temporal. Where would you find the primary motor cortex? Frontal or parietal? Frontal. Primary motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. Specifically, what part of the frontal lobe?
The precentral gyrus.
The precentral gyrus. Where do you find the primary somatosensory cortex? That's in the parietal lobe. In the postcentral gyrus. Did I mention Broca's area and Wernicke's area? I don't remember. Let me add those 2 while we're talking about this, because they are important. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, just in front of the primary motor cortex and down towards the bottom of it. It plays a very important role in speech production. Broca''s. Wernicke's area, which is Wernicke'S, is located in it actually overlaps the temporal and parietal lobes behind the postcentral gyrus, and it's involved in speech comprehension. And in most people, it's those 2 areas in the left hemisphere that are most important. The corresponding areas in the right hemisphere don't play that much of a role in speech and language. It's one of the few brain functions that's pretty much lateralized to one side of the brain. And here it's appropriate to talk about left brain, right brain, and in a lot of other cases, it's not appropriate to talk about left brain, right brain like they love to do over in fine arts. I have a running debate going on with Brent Shoulders about left brain, right brain. I don't know if I call it a debate, more of a discussion. He's big on left brain, right brain, I'm not. Okay. How about the corpus callosum? What does it do?
It's the communication pathway between two.
Yeah, it's a major communication pathway between the two cerebral hemispheres. What situation did I tell you about in which in some patients as the treatment of last resort, the corpus callosum is partially or completely severed?
Epilepsy.
Epilepsy.
Apparently his notes were pretty good.
Huh?
Said apparently Walker's notes were pretty good.
Yeah, I figured he probably kept pretty good notes. And the reason they sever the corpus callosum is to prevent the spreading of the seizure activity from one hemisphere over to the other hemisphere. But that's a pretty drastic intervention, and you don't do that unless that's the only choice you got. Well, let's see. Let me think of some other brain structures we talked about. Oh, I know one, the reticular formation, which is more of a network of nerve fibers than it is a brain structure. Does Walker have a network of nerve fibers?
Network of nerve fibers that regulates level of arousal.
That's big, that's right. What part of the brain forms a bridge between the two halves of the cerebellum?
Pons.
Pons. You weren't even here, and she's answering more questions than you two people who were here.
I wasn't here.
Oh,
I
you
wasn't
weren't
here
here?
all last week.
Okay. I guess it was Walker and Kyla that were here.
I'm just making sure I have it.
Huh?
I'm just making sure I have it.
Okay. Let me look at that chapter and see if I have something in, oh, what could you tell me about the autonomic nervous system? And the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Could you draw a diagram illustrating the divisions of the nervous system? And tell me briefly what each part does. The fight or flight response is produced by sympathetic or parasympathetic activity.
Sympathetic.
Sympathetic. What could you tell me about oh, good Lord. You think you could tell me about the processes involved in the resting membrane potential? You think you could tell me or understand what happens in the generation and propagation of an action potential? Think you can tell? Okay, what's going to happen if, or let me rephrase this. The movement of what ion is responsible for the action potential?
Sodium?
Sodium. Sodium moving where? Into the cell or out of the cell?
In.
Into the cell. And that produces depolarization. If you have chloride moving into the cell, what's going to happen there? Depolarization or hyperpolarization? Hyperpolarization. What's saltatory conduction? And what type of neurons do you find saltatory conduction? It's illustrated on page 57. You find it in myelinated axons, where you have the myelin sheaths that are separated by nodes of Ranvier, and the action potential basically just jumps from one node to the next. And that's one of the reasons that a myelinated axon transmits the signal faster than an unmyelinated axon. What's the other reason that what's the other factor that can influence the speed of transmission of an action potential, besides the presence of myelin?
Diameter of the axon. The diameter of the axon.
Diameter of the axon. The larger the diameter, the faster the conduction. What's the voltage difference when the membrane is at rest? Or the typical voltage difference that we use to illustrate the resting membrane potential?
Negative 70 millivolts.
Negative 70 millivolts. What's a coronal plane versus a horizontal plane versus a sagittal plane? Okay, know those. Know what the terms ventral, dorsal mean, rostral, caudal, distal, proximal, lateral, medial, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior. In the spinal cord, you have gray matter and white matter. If you're looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, the gray matter is located where? Towards the middle of the spinal cord or around the periphery of the spinal cord?
The middle.
The middle. And it's surrounded by white matter. The difference between white matter and gray matter is what?
The presence of myelin.
The presence of myelin and white matter. If pathways in the spinal cord are carrying signals up and down the spinal cord, are those signals being carried in the white matter or the gray matter?
Gray. The gray. The white.
Up and down, the white. As in the gray matter, you primarily have conduction of signals within that level of the spinal cord. But if you're going up to the brain or down from the brain to another part of the body, it's going to be the white matter that carries those because it's having to travel a fair distance. The dorsal root of a spinal nerve, is it sensory or motor?
Sensory.
Sensory. The ventral root is motor. How many spinal nerves are there? How many pairs of spinal nerves?
12.
That's cranial
Oh.
nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Do you have to know the names of all those nerves? No. If your sympathetic nervous system is activated, what's going to happen to heart rate?
If what?
If your sympathetic nervous system is activated, what's going to happen to your heart rate?
It'll increase.
It's going to increase. The current state, I mean, like the way you feel right now in terms of your autonomic nervous system, is that primarily parasympathetic activity going on or sympathetic activity?
Parasympathetic.
Yeah, because y'all look pretty relaxed. You look pretty laid back. Kyla got her feet propped up, twirling her hair over there. She doesn't look like she's too agitated, at least not on the surface. But does that mean that because you're pretty relaxed, that your sympathetic nervous system is not doing anything?
No.
Okay. It's just that the activity in the sympathetic is outweighed by the parasympathetic activity right now. But if you're going down the highway and you have a near accident and it scares the crap out of you, that's going to be caused by a surge in sympathetic nervous system activity. Basal ganglia. What are the three components of the basal ganglia?
The caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus.
You got them all right. Mispronounced putamen is putamen. But you wouldn't know that unless you were here to hear me say it. Basal ganglia involved in motor behavior. Name some structures that are considered to be part of the limbic system.
The amygdala, the hippocampus.
Those are two in particular that I focused on. Let's pick on the amygdala. What did I say about the amygdala? Involved in anxiety and fear. Hippocampus involved in memory consolidation and involved in spatial memory, your ability to have a cognitive map of how to get from one place to another, of where things are located in space. And I said that the limbic system is a system that is easily understood, didn't I? No, I didn't. I even said that people can't even agree on exactly what structures to include in the limbic system. And that if anybody told you that they really fully understood the limbic system, they're feeding you full of crap. Overall, I did say the limbic system played an important role in emotions and motivation. There's a diagram on page 70 that shows some of the structures. One of those is shown in light purple called the cingulate cortex. Was there anything in particular I said about the cingulate cortex? particularly the anterior portion of it. Related to a psychological disorder. Or at least abnormal activity in this part of the brain is related to a particular psychological disorder. I don't even know if it mentions that in your book.
I think it says something about schizophrenia, but I didn't write it down.
Schizophrenia,
Yeah. No? Okay, I don't know, I didn't write it down.
obsessive compulsive disorder.
Oh, okay.
Concerning the cerebral cortex, I said that there are some functions that are more or less localized to particular parts of the cortex, but I said that the major portion of the cortex is basically integrating information from all the different parts of the cortex. And somewhere in the cortical areas that memories are stored and reasoning occurs and all that kind of thing. What was the general term I used to refer to that part of the cerebral cortex? Or those parts of the cortex? Association cortex. Do we know exactly where memories are stored and how they're stored? No, we don't. Do we know exactly how the brain is able to produce conscious thought? Produce consciousness? No, we don't. I do, I just don't want to tell you. I want you to figure it out on your own like I did. Believe that, Abby? Yeah, I started out asking you guys if you had any questions. I'm the one asking all the questions. Why is it that people, including myself, often when referring to people say you guys, even if it's all females? But yet it doesn't seem to bother females when you do that, or at least most females. You're certainly not guys.
I don't know, I'm probably just used to it. Expression.
You never hear anybody referring to several guys as gals.
In football.
They get offended, huh?
In football.
In football, they
Sports.
refer to guys as gals?
Sometimes I've watched shows where they call them girls and stuff. Not girls, but gals, ladies.
But typically in that case, they're making fun of them, right? No?
Probably.
Probably. Well, if you saw me and two other guys walking around and you referred to us as gals, I'd feel kind of funny. The females, most females don't seem to, I think it's just people know that there's a difference and it's just an easy way of referring to it. Just have it, I don't know. That won't be a trick question. Know the neurotransmitters. What neurotransmitters fall under the heading of catecholamines?
Epinephrine, norepinephrine, right?
And
There's one more.
dopamine.
Not serotonin. Yeah, I just remember it wasn't serotonin.
What's the most prominent inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain? Or most prevalent?
Adrenaline? No. Adrenaline? No. I don't know.
And in fact, you don't find just a whole lot of adrenaline or epinephrine in the brain. It's more of a hormone in the peripheral. What I'm looking for here, and in fact, adrenaline, that has a stimulant effect, an excitatory effect. I said inhibitory. This would be GABA,
Oh,
the
yeah.
amino acid neurotransmitter, or one of the amino acid neurotransmitters. What's the most prevalent excitatory neurotransmitter? Glutamate. What's one of the only gaseous neurotransmitters that's been identified at this point? Or is there such a thing as a gaseous neurotransmitter?
Nitric oxide.
Don't forget, what about, I'm not gonna go through them again, they're listed on page 79. The criteria that are used to identify a substance as being a neurotransmitter. Could you identify some of those? I can't overemphasize the importance of that diagram on page 83. What happens in normal synaptic transmission? What's the difference between an ionotropic receptor and a metabotropic receptor? Which produces a faster effect? Ionotropic, which produces a longer lasting effect. Metabotropic. G proteins play an important role in which type of receptor, ionotropic or metabotropic?
Metabotropic.
Metabotropic. What's the role of cyclic guanosine monophosphate, or cyclic GMP? If you got a puzzle, look, you should, because that's part of what I said you're not responsible for. You don't have to know all that extra information about second messengers. Unless, again, Abby, if you just want to, go right ahead.
Okay.
Well, we're out of time. I think that might have helped a little bit.